Britain is on the brink of breaking out into civil unrest, its streets ablaze and filled with angry protesters, and the state has no idea what to do. Leaking his cabinet briefing to the Times and the Daily Mail, Keir Starmer is sending up the flare to the public to say, if you cause any trouble, I will crack down on you with the full force of the law. And by the public, he means, as Dominic Cummings put in a recent Substack, the far right brackets code for white people. What they think is conflict only arises and integration doesn't happen when the native host population who do not want mass migration and multiculturalism notice the economic, cultural, and criminal problems of immigration on social media rather than immigration itself causing these problems. So you noticing the problem is itself the problem to the state. And so the only way they know to prevent social and civil unrest is further censorship and imprisoning people like Peter Lynch and Lucy Connolly. If they think that's going to stop it, they're deluded, but it doesn't look like, as David Betts has warned, there's much of a political off-ramp here. So here's the briefing that Keir Starmer gave to his cabinet with Angela Rayner and Liz Lloyd. He says, Britain is fraying at the edges. It is vital to repair Britain's social fabric and improve integration in areas that have experienced high levels of migration. How? Integration hasn't happened. It's impossible to integrate millions of migrants who have an apathetic or hostile attitude towards British culture and do not live around the native British host population and are people that the British host population didn't want here in the first place. Like, you can't do it. How are you going to integrate the cousin marrying enclaves from Mirpur, Pakistan, from which the racist Islamic Pakistani grooming gangs spawned, and which covered up for them, because they didn't want to be seen as siding with the white enemy, according to the head of the Ramadan Foundation in 2016. You can't do it. And so you've just got these antagonistic tribes existing in the same country who are not content to share the country, because one inherited the country from their ancestors and feel dispossessed of it, and the other, as is embodied by the likes of Bob Villan and the cheering crowd at Glastonbury, of all colours, think, well, if you want your country back, nuh-uh, we've stolen it, you're a gammon, and we're going to run you out of town. Shut the F up. So, those are the two tribes. Impossible for the state to reconcile this. Liz Lloyd recognises this. She says that actually the best way to improve Keir Starmer's falling popularity is a crackdown in law and order. So Lloyd said to a presentation to ministers at Chequers that social cohesion is fraying at the edges as services are unable to keep up with changes in time and migration. They genuinely think the state exists to make all of these disparate groups play nice, and so it is actually sufficiently funded public services that stop people from being angry at each other, not intractable, deeply entrenched cultural prejudices which are irreconcilable. She suggests a more forceful policy on law and order would be needed to restore waning trust in the government, as well as public service reform and a more active approach to the economy. Translation: higher taxes and throwing more white English people that complain about the problem in prison. Now, where do those taxes go? Well, it turns out lots of it is spent, as of 2024, 14.4 billion a year, on illegal migrants. And that includes housing the men that come over via the English Channel in hotels at taxpayers' expense. And these illegal migrants include one Ethiopian asylum seeker who, within days of arriving, allegedly sexually assaulted a 14-year-old girl in Epping. He lives at the Bale Hotel, or at least soon to be lived. And this kick-started 2 weeks now of protest by Essex locals, mums and dads, concerned families, against the government's plan to battery farm foreign sex offenders at their expense within the vicinity of a school. And this isn't the first time this has happened as well. This happened in Manchester in 2024. There were locals who noted that there was a migrant hotel right behind two schools in Altrincham, and this was the Cresta Court Hotel, they objected in a town hall meeting, and they were told by a community police officer, his name was Colin Dieter, that a curfew couldn't be imposed upon the men because, quote, we can't lock up people who haven't committed a crime. We live in a very tolerant and open society, and we have to continue that. And so in there is a liberal religious statement, a commitment to universal human rights, which treats every single person, including sex offenders from the third world, as indistinguishable and interchangeable with British children and concerned parents. But also, he has committed a crime. He's broken into the country. Every illegal migrant is illegal. But these people have genuinely imbibed the belief that no human is illegal, and therefore, if they've broken into the country, it is actually our fault for not giving them a safe and legal route into the country, because the logical endpoint of their ideology is the entire third world ends up here. And it is just a matter of laws that need to be changed and logistics that need to be ironed out in order to facilitate that, rather than the native host majority going, well, I didn't really want all of these Ethiopian sex offenders lurking around a girls' school, so can we not have that? Thank you. I mean, this also happened with a school in Deanshanger in January of this year. Parents were calling up the asylum hotel, and people were recorded, poor receptionist behind the desk, recorded saying, yeah, we've been getting a lot of reports for this, the police haven't done much. The police at once said that there is no evidence of this happening, but also they were going to talk to the men about their, quote, cultural expectations. So denying it was happening, while also saying, well, we know it's happening, so we'll give them a stern lecture on women's rights to sort it out. Turns out that the British public don't think stern lectures on women's rights are going to fix this, because this Epping protest has been massive, consistent, largely peaceful, and has spread nationwide to places like Ashford and Canary Wharf, where people have also found that sex offenders are being housed in hotels at public expense. The sex offender in question, or alleged sex offender, is Hadush Gerabalaze Kabatu from Ethiopia. Well, he was last in France, so he should have stayed there. But also, he shouldn't be here in the first place. He should be deported, whether or not he's committed these offences. Why are we pretending that every single last one of these men is some poor, benighted refugee, when, as we know from the story I helped GB News break in 2023, they pay people smugglers who advertise our women and girls as ripe for the taking by any enterprising man from the Middle East, North or Sub-Saharan Africa who happens to have a penchant for white women. We know this is what they think before they come here, so why are we shocked when this happens, disproportionately, from men from this region of the world who are willing to break every law and cross every border to come here to access the dwindling largesse of the British taxpayer and our wives, sisters, daughters, friends, even mothers. So this continued. And the reason the government are worried is because the police are wholly unprepared. Not only have lots of armed response officers and even riot police walked off the job since the fatal shooting of Chris Carbar, totally justified, by the way, because, I mean, he's alleged to have shot someone on a club dance floor, and he was a wanted suspect for this. So the armed officers in question were, one, worried about being driven at and killed by Carbar's car, but also worried about being shot, as is a risk with drill rap gangs in Brixton. But in the Telegraph, one of the heads of the Police Federation, Tiff Lynch, has actually written the police are being pulled in every direction and that they are incapable of actually quelling widespread civil unrest should it break out in the summer. So the state knows that they don't have the enforcement capacity to keep the British public in check if they no longer see the state as legitimate and therefore no longer go along with the enforcement of the laws. The reason the state enforces anarcho-tyranny is because they recognise there are two populations. There is a law-abiding population, usually the native host indigenous population, who will vote for the expansion of the security apparatus to crack down on the crime that the state itself has created and tolerated to expand its own powers. But also there's a clientele class of criminals, which the Labour Party has been releasing early, in order to actually make space for more mums and granddads like Lucy Conley and Peter Lynch who have sent tweets that they don't like while letting out, drug salesmen and people guilty of manslaughter. So they recognise this criminal underclass exists. They recognise that they are a client group that are more likely to vote for them. And they recognise that they can weaponise them against the native population like the Soviet gulags did with the murderers, thieves, and sex offenders imprisoned under the Tsarist regime against anti-communist dissidents. The state is doing the exact same thing here. And they do this because they recognise that the people they're victimising, the host majority, are more likely to go along with the laws because they see it as their country, their government, their culture, their laws. Whereas criminal immigrant groups without a conscience don't. They just act on impulse for their own gratification and have no loyalty to the state beyond the payments it can give and the permission it can provide them to commit crimes. But if the host majority no longer see the police as being on their side, no longer see the state as legitimate, no longer see the laws as something to abide by, well, the police can't hold that back. And again, I want to reiterate, don't cause any violence. Don't give the state that is looking for an excuse to lock you up a reason to. However, this is a prediction, not encouragement, a prediction, that if civil unrest were to become widespread, as the police themselves are telling us, the government and the armed forces and the police will be unable to control it. So they are petrified of this. So, why then did Essex police escort stand-up to racism protesters to the front line of the peaceful protest with parents? Why are they bringing communist agitators, and they are communist agitators, because they're members of the Socialist Workers' Party, why are they bringing them as a kind of communist conga line, leading them like they're on a school trip, to stand right beside the parents? And if you pause there, if you can see here, there's a couple of people dressed very suspiciously. They aren't holding signs. They have sunglasses. They have masks. Why are the police escorting disguised, masked protesters with nothing distinguishing them from the parents protesting, because they're not holding any signs like all of their compadres or comrades are? Why are the police escorting these people right to stand next to the parents? Is it to cause conflict, either from within the parents' protest using agent provocateurs, or just cause tensions to escalate sufficiently between the two groups as a pretext to shut the parents' protest down, call them all far-right, and delegitimize their concerns about illegal migration? David Shipley helped break the story. He's doing excellent work over at The Spectator and Telegraph. Recommend looking at his investigative journalism. When Essex police were presented with this video, beforehand they had equivocated and said, well, we didn't drive them there. We didn't bust them in. They did drive them home, though, by the way. They packed them in police vans and drove them home, so they gave them a lift back. But they tried to pretend that they had no role in bringing them to the protest site because they used the phrase, we didn't bust them in. When they were presented with video evidence by David Shipley, it was very telling. Assistant Chief Constable Stuart Hooper said, we have a reasonable duty to protect people who want to exercise their rights. In terms of bringing people to the hotel, the police have a duty to facilitate free assembly. We would only ever take people away from protest if we felt there was an immediate threat to people or property, to free up police resources, to protect others, or to prevent additional violence. In Epping, officers took all three of those into account before making their decision. So number one, in this justification, is the accusation that the people of Epping are violent, and that it would have otherwise been a perfectly reasonable and peaceful protest to escort all of these communist agitators from outside of Epping to this protest, if only the Epping locals didn't kick off and start attacking them. So it's an insult to the people of Epping. But also, suddenly, Essex police have discovered a commitment to free speech, which they didn't have when they were threatening Alison Pearson with arrest using a counter-terror unit for a deleted tweet about pro-Hamas and pro-Palestine marches. So excuse me if I don't think one of the most woke, censorious police forces in the country, who are addicted to non-crime hate incidents and Malicious Communications Act charges and public order offences, have suddenly down the back of the sofa discovered a copy of the European Convention on Human Rights and are extending this universally rather than to just their preferred client group, who look suspiciously like agent provocateurs. So, also, if Essex police were worried about violence, why did they escort Socialist Worker Party activists to the front line when they had already put in their newspaper, drive the Nazis out of Essex? So they define the concerned parents of Epping as genocidal, mid-century German white supremacists. Because presumably there are a bunch of Dutch Jews being housed in the Bell Hotel. Ah yes, you are hiding the Ethiopian sex offender in the attic, are you not? If the police knew that this is what the Socialist Worker thought of these parents, why bring them right next to each other? If violence had already kicked off after they'd escorted them there, why, as Laurie Wastel points out from a now deleted page on Essex Police's website, did they then, the following night, go to put anti-hotel protesters and counter-protesters next to one another in metal fences that could be easily torn down? Why did they continue to do this in the following days, when stand-up to racism agitators turned up with the trans pride flag for some reason? And refugees welcome signs? even though said refugee is allegedly a sex offender. Why are Essex police doing this? Do they want to provoke conflict as a pretext to crack down on the legitimate, law-abiding, peaceful protests of Epping's parents and others across the country that have started, inspired by this act of solidarity and concern for their children's well-being? Do they want to crack down on this because, as Liz Lloyd said, the Labour government needs a more forceful policy on law and order, which is, as Dominic Cummings suggested, code for the far right, brackets, white people. It's hard not to get conspiratorial when Epping, Essex police keep lying about the protest in Epping. So then the Epping Council voted to close the migrant hotel. This is despite one of the Conservative councillors, by the way, completely disgraceful, comparing the parents also to Nazis. This is despite the father of the alleged victim of the alleged migrant sex attack, saying that he stands with the protesters and supports what they do. So she's just slandering concerned mums as Nazis. Absolutely egregious. The council voted to close the hotel. Good on them. The Home Office still hasn't responded. They could well block it. Because originally their Bell Hotel was housing women and children who, one may argue, have a legitimate asylum claim. I think Britain is so far from every conceivable war zone and so culturally distant from all these countries that we shouldn't have to actually take in anyone. There are plenty of safe countries in their continent of origin that could house them much better. But by the by, if you were going to make the argument that there might be some women and children that we could house, well, turfing them out for single male asylum seekers, illegal migrants, who commit disproportionate sex offences, yeah, it's kind of easy how that could inflame community tensions. And for a Conservative councillor to call people, parents, concerned about that, Nazis, absolutely disgraceful. So, Home Office hasn't responded, as of time recording, hasn't commented, might still block this, but within hours, turns out, these men are being moved from the Bell Hotel to the 4-star Britannia International in Canary Wharf. Now, the hotel itself has denied this, but then they started putting up fencing and bussing in mattresses and bringing in new supplies. So, protests started out there. Organic protests. And again, within moments, Stand Up to Racism materialise to chant, "Say it loud, say it clear, refugees are welcome here, no borders, no nation, stop deportation. We are women, we can fight, we don't need the fascist right." I mean, he does look effeminate enough to be a woman. And "Saving children's your disguise, you are Nazis organised." Remember, this is what these people support. Charged with 3 counts of sexual assault, 1 of inciting a girl to engage in sexual activity, and 1 of harassment without violence. These people support bringing more of those men here. These women support bringing more sex offenders to this country. That is the end result of their policy. They know what they are protesting against, which is concerned parents trying to stop sex offenders coming to the country, and they do it anyway.
Refugees are welcome here! Refugees are welcome here!
Draped in the trans pride flag, incapable of switching up their NPC programming, screaming their throats out till they're hoarse. Who are these people? Anyone asking this question? I haven't seen any MPs ask it in Parliament yet, and it is important considering they play an outsized role in our politics, a massive impact on our media. For example, last summer, conspicuously, in August, when there were meant to be hundreds of far-right riots that didn't materialise, multiple newspapers ran front covers, despite being of different ideological persuasions like the Mail, the Mirror, the Times, and the Guardian, of this photo of Stand Up to Racism protesters, with all the same placards, presenting them as anti-racism protesters, or a unified front fighting the far right, a purely organic representation of the British public, and they were all the same image. Very strange, that. So, I launched a Freedom of Information request with my friend Lewis Brackpool to ask, just with a sample of these 4 front pages from August the 8th, 2024, if whether or not the government's Don't Look Back in Anger unit, RICU, RICU, the Research, Information and Communications unit at the Home Office, which, in the aftermath of terror attacks or during civil unrest, controls the front page of newspapers, controls news coverage of these events, and buses imams and faith leaders out to the site for photo ops. I asked whether or not they had any involvement in this, whether they haven't had any involvement in organising the protest, funding it, whether they had any involvement in the front pages that were published the following day by those newspapers. And the response from the Home Office was, well, we didn't write the headlines. Right. If and when a government that is sufficiently transparent takes power and releases all the files the British state has on the psyops it has waged on the public, if and when that happens, we will find out just how much manipulation has been centrally planned by the government. And, okay, let's say purely hypothetically, Stand Up to Racism, the Socialist Workers' Party, had nothing to do with the state, with intelligence agencies, with the Home Office itself. We still know that the Home Office has funneled money to the Paul Hamlin Foundation and other grievance industrial complex charities like Hope Not Hate to assemble what they call local migrant leaders, to assemble these sort of rapid response activist chapters to go out on the streets and agitate on behalf of mass immigration, a permissive asylum system, multiculturalism, anytime a spontaneous protest, like the ones in Epping, come up. And then their mere presence is used in newspaper front pages to say, well, anyone concerned about immigration is a member of the far right. So this is and Charlotte Gills reported on this on the Paul Hamlin Foundation very well, a network of leaders and organizations within towns who will respond to local needs and pressure points and share learning to enable rapid response to provocative elements. And so between 2020 and 2023, the Paul Hamlin Foundation received 1.36 million in government grants. That's in our tax money. I actually wrote about this in a piece for Courage Media right here, entitled "The British Public is Afraid and have had enough and the state is afraid." And there's a conspicuous amount of suggestions that, okay, even if Stand Up to Racism were not the direct beneficiaries, as alleged, of taxpayer subsidies, even if they haven't been collaborating with the mainstream media to distort the perceptions of the British public about the unpopularity of admitting thousands of foreign sex offenders at our expense, well, their members certainly are paid by the state, because it turns out they're backed by major trade unions and also MPs. So Diane Abbott and Belle Ribeiro Addy, Labour MPs, quite senior Labour MPs really, are speaking at Stand Up to Racism event very soon, alongside Mohammed Kosbar, who was a former member of the Met Police's Muslim Advisory Council and also is one of the chairmen of Finsbury Park Mosque, and a former General Secretary of the Muslim Council of Britain, which is meant to be banned from engaging with Whitehall and government, but that's not been upheld. Kosbar was removed by the Met Police because he praised the founder of Hamas as the master of the martyrs of the resistance after October 7th, which is just, a promise to repeat October 7th here in Britain against the British. Diane Abbott and Belle Ribeiro Addy think that's just fine, and so apparently does Keir Starmer, because he allows them to stay in the party without kicking them out. There's Diane Abbott in a keffiyeh and the least convincing wig of all time. Its other members include influential heads of unions. That includes the Vice President, Daniel Kebede. He's the General Secretary of the National Education Union, which is the largest education union in Britain. Stand Up to Racism were posting to members of the National Education Union materials to get them to come to counter-protests against Tommy Robinson's demonstrations in London, and encouraging them to put their materials in classroom displays and create after-school clubs to fight fascism. So this is a communist agitator group that is led by a member of the largest teachers' union in the country that is feeding communist activism into classes. So they're at least supported and partially bankrolled by the state. Also, Mick Whelan, who's a vice chairman of Stand Up to Racism and the Socialist Workers' Party, is also general secretary of ASLEF, the train union that brought the rails to a halt for 2 years before Labour got into power to basically frustrate the prior Conservative government, because even though the Conservative government were doing everything in terms of social progressivism that the unions wanted, there was still a little bit of friction and non-compliance by some elements in the Conservative Party, and they knew that the Labour Party is totally on board with their agenda and is why they won't punish any of their MPs for going to these Stand Up to Racism events, speakers of which have glorified Hamas. So they are state-paid agitators. They're used by the media to gaslight us in front pages. And this is why, when we start to notice on social media, the state's only response is to censor us. So the Online Safety Bill came into effect and has been censoring everything from protest footage to Katie Lamb's speech about the grooming gangs in Parliament for people who have not verified their age online. But also atop the 12,000 arrests every year for social media posts, atop the increased recording of non-crime hate incidents for Islamophobia, as promised by Yvette Cooper, atop the new definition of Islamophobia being invented by Angela Rayner and Dominic Grieve, in the midst of the grooming gang scandal, by people, Angela Rayner and Dominic Grieve, who previously supported the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims' definition of Islamophobia, which said it was racist to talk about the grooming gangs at all. Atop all of that, they're now inventing a new police squad to monitor anti-migrant posts on social media. So their only method of preventing civil unrest is actually accelerating the likelihood of civil unrest by confiscating our ability to seek redress for our grievances via speech, diplomacy, and the democratic vote. Instead, they have now assembled this new police force via the Home Office. This police force is called the National Internet Intelligence Investigations Team, and it works out of the National Police Coordination Centre in Westminster, as directed by the Home Secretary, the Home Office, the Civil Service, and most likely the same employees at Raiku, who tell us don't look back in anger anytime an Islamist goes and blows up a pop concert, or, as we see here, an Ethiopian allegedly attacks a 14-year-old girl. So, I'm inclined to agree with Professor David Betts here. The state has adopted such a superposition personality, as Cummings would say, that it tells itself these ideologically fictions. It casts a kind of spell over itself to maintain the illusion of control, and half believes it and is half petrified that the ideology they're telling themselves isn't true, so they sort of have to believe it more to stop themselves from feeling anxious. I think they're so deluded there's no political off-ramp. And I am worried, because there needs to be a political solution that arises soon to prevent widespread civil unrest, but as the discourse accelerates, I think everyone's getting more and more worried that it won't.